Thank you guys for joining me here on the last segment of today's show. We're going to talk about the Chicago Bears a little bit more here because I feel like we talked about the Vikings, the Packers, and the Lions a lot this episode. And I mean, not that we're ignoring the Bears, obviously, but they are the odd team out, right? The one team that hasn't had the season like all the rest of the teams in the division, right? The rest of the teams are near the top of the NFC, where the Bears have really struggled, and the struggles really culminated with the firing of Matt Eberflus, right? That felt like the final straw, like the last thing that would have to happen this season to kind of label it as a complete meltdown of what our expectations were. But this really was the last thing that could have happened in a season that, if it was going to end in a disappointment, it was going to be because they got rid of the offensive coordinator. The head coach wasn't doing great, so they fired him during the season. And I want to say that it was the right thing to do again, because waiting for the end of the season in a way, trying to not go through another change, kind of to protect Caleb Williams a little bit, that seemed irrelevant to me because Chicago wasn't going anywhere anyway. So firing him at the end of the year, as opposed to right now, it was going to be the same thing. And I'm sure, the Bears knew that it was going to happen anyway. But things, were boiling over also. I think that's also important to point out. The actions on the field were awful, were bad enough, right? Just having to watch it. But I think, like I mentioned, with the players kind of already having an inkling of what was going to happen, you got a good sense of that. That the players, were now turning on the head coach, that they were pointing the finger at him. And really, when you have that kind of atmosphere in the locker room, you can't keep it going. If only there was like 5 and 4 games left in the season. When it starts to go like that, you can't just allow it to happen just because there's 3 or 4 games left, right? They had to cut that off. So I think that also led to the firing of Matt Eberflus, and also you hear guys like Jalen Johnson talk about the firing and how he suggested like he kind of expected it to happen. Tevin Jenkins, another player that wasn't really, standing up for Matt Eberflus or anything like that, but rather, accepting of the decision. Same thing with DJ Moore. He reacted in a way that, he said in essence that he kind of knew that it was going to happen. So you can see why, it was time. The players were having this sort of attitude towards him, and he rightly should have been fired for, again, what we saw on the field was awful. But now, I mean, I mentioned all those other guys, but Caleb now had a chance to talk about it as well. And in Caleb's first season, it obviously hasn't gone great, not even, the bare minimum of what you'd consider an okay season. It hasn't even really been that. And usually, seasons like this are the beginning of how quarterbacks begin to get ruined, right? The first season, an iffy head coach, you don't really know too much about him, or you're not really confident in him going into the year. Things fall apart like they did for the Bears, and they move on to another guy, right? And then they bring in a new guy. The young quarterback has to learn a whole new system, and basically you don't see any progression, and maybe they get rid of that head coach, and it's a continuous cycle of coaches, players coming in. I mean, the Chicago Bears would know, right? They've done it a bunch of times already with Mitch, with Justin Fields during a time where they had Nick Foles in there trying to be their quarterback. Chicago would know exactly what we're trying to reference here, right? But Caleb isn't overly worried about all of that right now, and the long term effect that it could have. His experience in his first year, he's not really too worried about it, or what these changes could kind of affect him like going forward in the long term. And I thought it was pretty interesting what he had to say on it, because he said, I think this is a stepping stone of development. To be able to have all of this in my first year, I wouldn't say that I'm happy for it. Having these moments is definitely something that will help me in the future. And he also said that handling all of this in a short period of time, right? Because Shane Waldron wasn't fired too long ago, and then the head coach goes as well. He said it'll essentially just help him grow, and in a way just kind of help him mature a little bit. Expose him to, and I don't want to overdress this, kind of just expose him to what the NFL essentially is, right? It's a hard, cutthroat sort of business, right? And it really doesn't have any, ill feelings about any player or coach, right? If you're not performing, if you're not doing your job out there, and it's kind of obvious, like this decision was, there's no like freebies or just staying on or like pity a lot of the times. If you're not doing a good job, there's no problem moving on. The quarterbacks, teams shuffle through them like it's nothing. The coaches, the coordinators, it's an ever flowing thing. So, it's reality. It's a bit of a harsh reality, right? When you're talking about development and building chemistry and things like that, right? A lot of the times it doesn't fall like you'd hope for. But I think Caleb, put it in a good way where he said that it is going to help him, harden him, kind of scab him to the idea that this is how it is, and going through all of this, if you're able to get through it and come out on the other end pretty well for yourself, I think I would agree with him that this is only going to make him better. And it's not like this year. I feel like Bryce Young struggled a lot more in his first year, and this year for Caleb, we've seen some moments of why he was selected as the number one overall pick. The game against the Lions, he could have won that game. He could have beat the Packers as well. And, he could have beaten the Commanders as well, if not for that Hail Mary. There's some games in there where he's made some pretty impressive throws. He's had some pretty impressive drives as well. Some pretty phenomenal second halves, just going back to the Lions game as well, where he throws like 3 touchdowns and gets his team back into it. There is moments, there is, that sort of hope and promise there for Caleb. I don't think it's been as bad as other quarterbacks that we have seen in these exact scenarios. So that gives you a bit more optimism. And the fact that Caleb is kind of has this mindset about it even makes me even more confident that the Bears have their guy here. I think they really do. But I think that this decision, right now they have an interim head coach with Thomas Brown. He's the play caller, but now he is the interim head coach for the rest of the season. We've seen that growth already too from Caleb, right? From where he was to where he is right now. Thomas Brown's been a big part of that. And since Thomas Brown took over as the play caller, we've seen Caleb Williams' QBR go from 30 to 77. The completion percentage has increased as well. The yards per dropback have gone from 4.9 to 6.2. And in this time with Thomas Brown, Caleb Williams has thrown 5 touchdowns and no interceptions as well. So I agree with Caleb and everything he said. The idea of it just helps him grow up quickly, right? A lot of the times the best lessons you get come from the lowest of lows, the hardest of falls and failures, right? The Bears, I really like what they have here in him, and Thomas Brown clearly has done a good job, so he should be also under consideration as the play caller or as the head coach maybe even. But on that point, on looking forward now, there might not be a bigger, more impactful decision that's made in the NFL offseason more than who the head coach of the Bears is going to be. Quite honestly, if they don't get it right and we get another season like this, then this whole thing could really be in danger. That's why the opportunity, and I don't really think I'm overdoing it, I honestly think that the next guy that comes in here, if they could hit the ground running with Caleb and build on what we've seen over the last couple weeks and hopefully going forward for the last like 4 or 5, if he continues to improve and be on that trajectory, then we're going to have something here, right? Then they're going to be what I think a lot of people hope that they would have been this year, if not for the head coach and the guys in charge, right? They have to break this recent track record with the quarterbacks, especially because I believe also that they have the most talented quarterback that they've had in a long time in Caleb Williams. With a solid roster as well, they have the best situation, arguably, that they've ever had around one of these young quarterbacks that they've brought in. So they have all the pieces here. They just got to find a way to put it all together. And having the head coach there is the final piece of the puzzle. It's what makes everything complete, right? You can have all these pieces and it looks pretty nice from the outside looking in, but you look at that picture, you look at that puzzle a little bit closer, and you notice that it's not a complete picture because you're missing the most important piece, right? The head coach, right? The guy that leads this team, this young team, not to mention also. So they have to get it right at this point. And, the names that are being typically thrown out there are your Ben Johnsons, your Kellen Moores would be an interesting one. Other guys like Aaron Glenn for the Lions as well. He should definitely be getting a lot of looks, in my opinion. Arthur Smith, I'll throw him out there for the Steelers offensive coordinator. I mean, their offense has been looking pretty well, so, why not? Joe Brady's another one, too, for the Buffalo Bills. He's really, from what the Bills were in the first half of last season to the second half and then until now, they're playing like one of the best teams in the NFL, so I'm sure he's going to get a bunch of calls as well on those things. So there's a lot of candidates out there, and you can't go wrong with any of them. Thomas Brown's another one, right? If you want to make that decision, and it would be a pretty, not bold, but it would be a little surprising, but he's done a great job, so I'm not saying he doesn't deserve it, but I feel like they would go from the outside to come in, but I don't know. If he gets it, that's great for him. But he would be another interesting one that you can't completely turn your head from. But the last thing I will say on this, and why, I'm mentioning this as a huge, organizational, future-altering kind of decision, right, for the Chicago Bears, why I don't think it's an exaggeration, is because you look at the rest of the quarterbacks that have been drafted, right? Jaden Daniels, ideal situation, right? Ideally, that's what you want drafting a first-round quarterback to look like, right? Jaden Daniels is already off and running. Drake May, it took him a couple weeks, right? But he looks like everybody in New England loves him and they believe in him. So he's already, off and running ahead of Caleb. Bo Nix is another one. The last quarterback taken, he could be in the playoffs this year, much like Jaden. So he's also a lot further ahead in terms of fit and how everything's developed than Caleb Williams, right? So you're always going to have these constant callbacks, comparisons to those guys, and maybe, we're not even at J.J. McCarthy yet or Michael Penix, right? The decision to draft Caleb, it's always going to go back and be compared to Jaden, Drake, and Bo. So with that being the case, you don't want this to be a massive blemish, like you drafted number 1 overall. You could have drafted any of these guys. You took Caleb, not a bad choice, but you messed it up so badly compared to these other teams that you're still back there where the other teams are years ahead of you. I think that is also a huge thing to point out because, all these other teams were arguably in the same spot that the Bears were, and arguably in worse situations around their quarterbacks, but they're making it work. They're obviously doing something that the Bears aren't doing clearly this year. So that's also another, threat that you want to avoid, right? You don't want to be the one team that got it wrong where everybody else around you hit the nail on the head. So that's why I think this decision is so important. Not only, again, because of those comparisons, but because I do believe that Caleb is a great quarterback. They just can't mess it up like they've kind of been known to. So they got to break this trend here. And the next head coach that comes in has to be the right choice. It just has to be for the Chicago Bears if they want to turn their luck around. So that is all on Caleb Williams and in this segment. Thank you guys for joining me on today's episode. Please remember to like, follow, and subscribe to the Chip Shot Football Podcast, as well as following the network on all forms of social media and checking out the YouTube channels to catch more content around the Chip Shot Football Podcast. And also a reminder to join me every weekday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time when these live shows go live, obviously, and go on air, where we cover the NFL, all the breaking news, discussions, the games, predicting them, all that sort of stuff. You can catch it here on the Chip Shot Football Podcast with me, Manny Maradiaga, as your host. We're just minutes away from Thursday Night Football. Go watch the game, and we'll be back here tomorrow to discuss that and look ahead to Week 14.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great. I don't wanna go to